أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجهم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So last session we finished up the first chapter, the first section, the introductory section, and then we began with the first session, the first major chapter. This chapter is entitled The Conceptual Outline. Shaykh Mutahhari rahmatullah alayh begins by giving us a general outline before we go into in depth the idea of justice, the meanings, the definitions, and then the objections, the criticisms. And we had outlined this in I think one of the first sessions as well, in terms of what in the future, how Shaykh Mutahhari will actually address this. So because this is a heavy topic, it's a difficult one, he has to go piece by piece, because if we were to jump, as I don't know, those of you who may be following along with the actual book, to try to impart all this information in one short paragraph or even one short chapter is, in a sense, impossible for those who are not already trained in some level of Islamic philosophy or theology or aqidah. If these discussions are happening to, let's say, the general public, or many of us who may not have a background in these sciences, it's going to be very difficult without going through some muqaddamat and preliminaries to jump into some of these major conversations. So that's one of the reasons why it seems as though it's kind of stretched out. But inshallah, hopefully each of the points that he mentions is something that adds to our aqidah and it's beneficial. So where we left off, he began the conversation by saying, first we have to distinguish that there is a difference between what we call human justice and divine justice. And he said, even if we conceptualize what human justice is, that's in terms of huquq and rights, or as we say, haqqun nas, the rights of people. If we take that approach from the beginning, and we just say justice is about rights, the same way that it deals with human beings, he said, in order to understand rights, we also have to talk about priorities of rights, that different people have priorities over different individuals and their property or whatever. He said, if that's the way that we're going to go about this conversation, and the definition is used that way, well then this conversation is finished, because there is no one or nothing that has priority over Allah. So the definition of justice then is gone, and it's impossible for Allah to do injustice and dhulm to anything, because it's all His property. It's His world, His creation, He can do whatever He wants. And the example that was given last time was, in the same way we buy toys for our children or our grandchildren, we have priority over that. We're allowing our kids to use them, right? We allow them to live in our homes and do all this. They may feel a sense of entitlement and ownership, but it's ours at the end of the day. So we can do whatever we want, right, with those items, with our house, our car, whatever it is. So even though we allow them to play and to live, wear these clothes, at the end of the day, we have priority of ownership and rights over it. We can take it away, we can destroy it, we can sell it, do whatever we want. So in the same way, if we take a human idea of justice, then the conversation's finished. So he says we can't use that definition. It might seem like it, but that's not a good way to approach this. He said, okay, so then we have to figure out, is there then a divine justice? Is there a different definition and a way of understanding that? And before we get to, which we'll do tonight inshallah, is the various definitions that they try to apply to Allah. Well, is it even worth discussing? Meaning, if Allah is not talking about this concept Himself, then this conversation is also useless too. Sometimes we have our own ideas as human beings, and we want to force feed that onto Allah, as we mentioned last week. So we have to make sure, okay, this adala and adl and justice, is this something that we're making up as human beings, or is Allah saying, no, it's a reality that you should understand as well too? And the easy, short answer is yes, of course. As Shaykh Mutahhari's mentioned in the introduction, and he reiterates over here in a different manner, because of the main text, the Quran, and how Allah has addressed it in multiple different ways, it's clear Allah wants us not just only to think about justice and adala and adl, but rather there's different dimensions and aspects to think about the concept of justice. So he mentions that, he said there are different ways that Allah has divided up the conversation in the Quran, but he mentions, let's say, I think 4 different types. Okay, so this is in terms of the Quran, right? So in the Quran, firstly, he has something which we call the sociological level. So what does that mean? This has to do with, in order for a society to function, it needs a sense of justice. In order for that to happen on behalf of Allah, this is where the idea of nubuwwah and prophethood comes in. Allah, in order for His version of justice to come down to our societies, He has to send down individuals, prophets, messengers, anbiya, mursaleen, that are going to do ijra and perform and execute this version of justice. So what we call social or sociological justice. So, for example, one of the ayat that he brings to further this point is in Surah Al-Hadeeth, chapter 57, ayah 25, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلَنَا بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ وَأَنزَلْنَا مَعَهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْمِيزَانَ لِيَقُومَ النَّاسِ بِالْقِسْطِ. We have already sent messengers with bayyanat, with clear evidence, and we've sent them down with the kitab, with whatever scripture that they had come with, and the mizan, right, this balance. Why? So that people can maintain their affairs, right? They can live in a sense of justice. So this is one of the major missions of the anbiya, of the prophets, so that they can establish justice. So this is one example, right? Or this is one dimension, and there's many other ayat, but we're just going to give one example so we can move on with the discussion. After that, we have what's in English it's called eschatological. Which basically has to do with the concept of what we say is ma'ad. You know, when we talk about the usul-din, we say tawheed, adal, nabuwa, imama, and qiyamah. That's how we've pretty much all been taught. Technically, adal is not part of the usul-din, it's just an extension of Allah's tawheed. And even they'd say imamat is not something separate, it falls under as an extension of nabuwa, meaning it's the prophets who had designated some sort of wilayah to somebody else before they had left, right? Whether it was representatives or actual the imams that we know as the ma'sumin. So in essence, what we have is three, is tawheed, nabuwa, and qiyamah. Even qiyamah is technically not exactly correct either. In the books of our ulama, and in riwayat, it's mentioned as ma'ad. Why? Because qiyamah, when we say yawm al-qiyamah, that's only talking about one aspect and one part of the afterlife, of yawm al-akhirah. But akhirah is composed of many different parts, right? The idea, the concept of death itself, what happens in the grave, what happens in barzakh, all these ideas have to do with ma'ad, which means the return or afterlife. So afterlife itself, with everything that it contains, which part of that is obviously yawm al-qiyamah, that is what's mentioned as one of the usul-din. That a person has to believe in all of what comes after this dunya, not just one part of yawm al-qiyamah. That's one of the usul and asl. Anyway, so over here there are many ayat which talks about the sense of justice, meaning if we don't achieve sociological justice, and of course even during the time of the prophets they had tried, but it didn't always work out. Many zalimeen, unfortunately, many munafiqeen were allowed to take power, they were allowed to reign, and they did dhulm. And we would naturally ask, okay, Allah, you wanted justice to be done. You wanted mizan, qist, adal, but it didn't happen even when prophets were in charge, even when imams were in charge. So where is this justice going to take place then? Well, it takes place in the afterlife. Whether at that time of death, whether they're going through that death, whether it's in the grave, whether it's in barzakh, or eventually on yawm al-qiyamah, in Jahannam, whatever it happens to be. That's where the ultimate sort of court system and justice system takes place over there. So, for example, Surah Anbiya, Surah 21, Ayah 47. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَنَدُعَ الْمَوَازِينَ الْقِسْطِ لِيَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ فَلَا تُظْلَمُ نَفْسٌ شَيْئًا وَإِنْ كَانَ مِثْقَالَ حَبَّةٍ مِّنْ خَرْدٍ آتَيْنَا إِيهَا وَكَفَى بِنَا حَسِيبٍ. And we place the scales of justice for Yawm al-Qiyamah, the day of resurrection. So no soul will be treated unjustly at all, right? And even if there's a weight, a small amount of a mustard seed, then we will bring it forth and sufficient as we are accountant and doing hisab of all this. So Allah is saying, if it doesn't happen in the dunya, then this justice will take place in the akhirah. So we have many ayat which talk about that as well. Then we have two other categories that are mentioned in the Quran. Both of them having to do with Allah and what we call literally divine justice then, or His justice. One of them is a negation. One of them is an affirmation. The negation, of course, is negation of what? Of dhulm. Allah doesn't do any dhulm, doesn't do any injustice. And the affirmation is, of course, that Allah is just, that it's adala. So we have these throughout the Quran as well too. There's no such thing as divine oppression. It doesn't happen. right? That's what's mentioned by this. So for example, Surah Tawbah, ayah 70. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. ألم يأتهم نبأ الذين من قبلهم قوم نوح وعاد وثمود وقوم إبراهيم وأصحاب مدين والمؤتفكات أتتهم رسلنا بالبينات فما كان الله ليظلمهم ولكن كانوا أنفسهم يظلمون. So has there not reached them the news of people before them? The people of Nuh alayhi salam, of Aad and Thamud, the people of Ibrahim alayhi salam, the companions of Madian, their towns were overturned. Their messengers came to them with clear proofs, and Allah would never have done any dhulm to them, but instead they did dhulm to their own nafs. As we say in Dua Kumel, dhalamtu nafsi. Any dhulm that happens, it's our own creation, it's what we are doing. Allah does not do any dhulm to anyone at all. So that's one type. Then the affirmation comes of justice, meaning divine justice. In Surah 3, Ayah 18, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, شهد الله أنه لا إله إلا هو والملائكة وأولو العلم قائما بالقسط لا إله إلا هو العزيز الحكيم. Allah Himself is doing shahada. He is shahid and witnesses that there is no ilah, there's no deity, nothing worthy of worship except for Him. As well as the angels and those with ilm, they also witness this as well, that what Allah is maintaining creation, in parentheses, with justice. And there is no ilah except for Him, and He's the exalted in might and wise. So Allah is affirming that everything in existence, He is maintaining it with this qist and this sense of justice. So Shaykh Mutahari's point of talking about divine justice is yes. The answer, of course, is yes. Human justice is not something we can apply, but there is clearly a sense of divine justice, whether it's at the sociological, dunyawi phase or aspect or dimension, whether it's in the akhirah, or whether it goes back to Allah Himself. Allah is affirming, I don't do dhulm, I will not do any injustice, and in fact, I'm maintaining everything with a sense of justice. So now, okay, that means yes, there is divine justice. So now we have to go into the definitions and figure out how we're supposed to answer these questions, inshallah. Please recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So this is now where we can move on to the next subsection, where he begins talking about what he calls the various lines of approach. This idea of justice, as we talked about in the introduction, it's been uniquely addressed by various different groups, right? So he mentions the major categories, and I think this probably includes, and I think this is everyone, every type of group that could exist, right? Whether it's the past or the present in terms of the Muslims. First group is the ul-Hadeeth, the traditionalists, the mutakallimin, the theologians, the ones who do kalam, the Hukamaa, the philosophers, the urafa, which sometimes are grouped as one, the Hukamaa and the urafa, the philosophers and the urafa, the mystics. And lastly, he mentions empiricists. And we'll talk a little bit about the empiricists because he focuses a lot of time on what they mean. Each of them have their own methodology. So he wants to mention what their methodologies are, and to some degree mentioning why that there are issues with those methodologies and how we have to respond to those two. Now again, he's just outlining it. The details for what we want to go through is going to be, as we mentioned, the philosophical methodology. Philosophical / the methodology of the urafa, the metaphysical approach. That methodology requires details. So for those of you who are following the text, you'll see that as he mentions every single point, he says, I'm mentioning it in generality right now, but later on, there's going to be a specific chapter or a subsection that deals with this in detail. So he does this a lot, as we already mentioned, that it's a lot to take in because he wants to prime our minds for this and then say, okay, here's the basic thing that you have to understand, but we're going to lay out the framework for this a little bit later on. So the way that this is broken down is that there are two different groups. In terms of line of approach, you've got now two. One group says all this conversation about divine justice and Allah's justice and oppression and dhulm, all of this, at the end of the day, it's haram. You can't even discuss this, you can't ask questions, there's no point. It's a bid'ah. Don't bother with this, don't engage. Our job is to have iman, have trust in the Quran, in Allah, in His words, in what the Prophet has said. That's it. That's what we do. Now, out of all the groups that we mentioned, which of those do you think is going to say something like this? So Ash'ari, to some degree, they're actually going to fall in the second group, but their conclusion basically ends up being almost the same thing. But there was another group that was a bit stricter than them. It was one we talked about, I think, in the last session and the session before as well too. The ones who were very strict when it came to fiqh, they didn't want any aql involved in anything at all. So that first group is the ul-Hadeeth, right? The traditionalists, right? So these traditionalists, they said, no, we are not allowed to engage in this. Because the same way, when they dealt with their fiqh, if we remember that conversation, they said, there is no aql allowed. We don't talk about proofs. We don't talk about logic. None of this is allowed in fiqh. So the way that they would approach any of these things in aqeedah, they did the same exact thing. They said, it's in the Quran, that's enough. Prophet had talked about it, that's enough. Why are you asking questions? Whatever idea we have in mind about, let's say, like Wahhabi Salafis, that's pretty much what we're talking about over here. Wahhabi Salafis, it's a bit more complicated to see how they descend from these groups, but that's kind of what they are. The Ahlul Hadith are basically saying the conversation about this is a bid'ah itself. Who told you you're allowed to ask these questions? Don't ask why, trust, and that's it. If you think about this and you start to question, that's a bid'ah, it's an innovation, it's not allowed in Islam, and that's where they get because it's a bid'ah, that's where they come up with the idea that it's haram. Now they are the only group that said this. Every other group that came along, including the Ash'ariyah, they said no, you are allowed, at the beginning you can talk about it. Now the Ash'ariyah, the difference was, and we'll get to the details, they felt that because people we're not sure about it yet, it's a wazifa and it's a duty for us, we have to answer these questions. But as we'll see, the problem is their conclusions were pretty much no different than them, right? For them, they said, look, there is no such thing as divine justice, like who cares? Leave it alone. Now, for this group, which basically said it's jaiz, in another way that it's our duty, we have to talk about it. Or we're allowing at the beginning, we can talk about it. Okay, so now, who are we talking about here? So the first group that we said are the mutakallimin, the theologians. Mutakallimin is the Arabic, theologian is what we say in English. Mutakallimin meaning somebody who engages in kalam. Their focus is discussing aqeedah and aqaid and beliefs, our theology, right? That's what they do. So amongst these, we said that there were two groups as well. Right? We said we had the Ash'aris, and then those who allowed the aql, the ones who were pro-aql, which were Mu'tazila and the Shi'ah. These two groups said, yeah, you can use your aql. But the first group said, no, that's not allowed, but they were still discussing it, right? That's what was happening. So let's talk about the Ash'ari first. So let's backtrack. We talked about it in the beginning when we talked about the four problems about what the Ash'aris believed. What was their view on good and evil? What did they say, if anybody remembers? The Ash'ari group. Sorry? Everything is? Everything's from Allah, right? So they said, look, there's no rationalizing, there's no concrete idea of good and evil, right? So that was one idea. So since there's no concrete idea of good and evil, what the other group was doing is connecting good and evil to justice and injustice, right? They said justice is good and injustice is evil. They said none of those words have any meaning. Good and evil doesn't have a meaning for us, therefore justice and injustice doesn't really have a meaning either. The second point, they said, the Ash'ari said, we don't want to hold Allah accountable to anything or anybody, right? They're trying to preserve pure tawheed. No shirk involved. They said, okay, so Allah is not accountable to any concepts, so no good and evil, no aql, nothing like that. In addition, because this is going to be a question that they have to try to answer, if Allah mentions something in the Quran about justice and injustice, that Allah won't do this and will do this, even the Ash'aris will say, Allah's not accountable to the Quran either. Which I know, it sounds very strange, laughable even, And Shaykh Mutahhari mentions this. He says, look, if you want answers about how they reconcile this, go ask them, because we can't figure it out and they can't figure it out. We don't know what they're talking about. But Allah is speaking in the Quran, mentioning justice and injustice for our sake, basically, but He's not bound by that. If Allah wants to go against the promises in the Quran, He has that right, and it'll still be justice. Right? So He says, we can't make Him accountable, pure tawheed. Right? So now they come up with this, I'll write down the sort of the proof that they offer. So again, they're not applying what we call the aql, but they have a premise, they have a conclusion. That's definitely being done. It's not as strong as others, but we'll go with that. So, they said, okay, here's our sort of if over here. If all this stuff is correct. We know that the way that we are defining justice is that justice is what? Justice is equivalent to divine actions, or divine acts, right? As they already proved. Whatever Allah does, that's going to be just. That's the definition of it. So justice equals whatever Allah is acting, whatever He's doing, right? So then, okay. When it came to the question of free will and human agency, what was their view? None. So they had the view of Jabr, right? Jabr meant Allah is just forcing us, right? So Jabr says no free will for humans. Okay? So, if we have no free will, meaning we're not performing any actions then, the only agent and actor then is Allah. So, if the only thing or entity, only actor and agent or fa'il is Allah, and we already said that divine actions are justice, then what? Then basically you get everything is just, right? Because everything is from Allah. By definition. There's no room for evil. There's no meaning. There's no meaning of injustice because it's all from Allah. He's forcing us. He's the one acting out our actions. We don't have the free will to do that. There is no such meaning. Justice and injustice don't make any sense because it's all going back to Allah in the first place. And they already showed that since we don't have agency and anything that comes from Allah is already justice, well, okay, we're done. The conversation became different. Now, what might happen is, okay, how is it different than them? At the end of the day, it seems similar. So the difference is minor. The ul-Hadeeth were saying, you can't talk about this. The Ash'aris were saying, no, we can talk about it, but our conclusion is going to be the same. Through their discussion and their conclusions, because they had a duty, they had Muslims who were confused, they said, we're going to answer a question, we're going to reach the same conclusion as them, that at the end of the day, everything is just, so there's no point in talking about it. They weren't saying it's haram necessarily, they weren't saying bid'ah, they're saying, look, after we explain to you that you don't have free will, that everything is from Allah, then you're just going to realize that justice and injustice are meaningless anyway. Good and evil are meaningless, so the conversation's finished. So in essence, their conclusions were the same, right? There was no problem. Now, the issue is here. We can try our best to, empathize maybe to some degree. They wanted to protect Allah, so to speak, right? We call it tanzih. They don't want Allah to be accused of shirk. They don't want partners and associates. Okay, that's good. They want Allah to hold on to His tawheed. And they want Muslims to hold on to that as well too. Okay, that's good. The problem is, as they tried to protect Allah from that shirk, they also said, okay, well, we know that Allah doesn't do dhulm. We know that, obviously. So we have to figure out a way to get rid of the concept of dhulm from Allah, which they did. But what was the conclusions of what they had done? By protecting Allah from dhulm, they also made and casted their net so wide that who else became protected? Al-Zalimeen, as we mentioned in the introduction. So now any Khalifa, any the Umayyads, Abbasids, who many of them push for this Ash'ari theology for a reason. Why? Because now it's not me doing it, it's Allah. Allah made me your Khalifa. Or as Ibn Ziyad says, what did you think of what Allah had done to your family? Allah killed your family. Right? Even there you see that theological discussion between Ibn Ziyad and Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. Yeah.
But then how do they reconcile with the opposition? Because technically the opposition to the whoever it was, from the Zalimeen, they're also doing whatever Allah has acted.
Yeah. So, yeah, so how did they reconcile people standing up to the zalimeen? So, well, I mean, that point is going to come, but basically, that's the next point that Shaykh Mutahari mentions. When this is your theology, then who else now basically has no duty and responsibility? The oppressed. If you're sitting there as a madhloom, you're not allowed to do anything about it. If you think that there's dhulm in this world, that's your fault. That's not what it is. And you see that the oppressed then have no recourse anymore. They just have to sit there and live in what they think is oppression. And of course, whatever theologians will come and tell them, no, it's not oppression in the first place. Or they'll say, your job is to what? Have sabr. Just be patient. And take that alongside their other part of theology, which is you can't rise up against the Khalifa too. Right? They connect all these ideas together. You can't rise up. And part of it is because Allah's put him there in the first place. Your job is just to have sabr, and that's it. Yeah. So the distinction that they try to make is that these people are going against what Allah wants. But again, this is the problem, is that, what do you mean? There's no way you can go against what Allah wants. Because the response is, didn't Allah just make them do that in the first place? This is the only way they try to answer the problem of dhulm. They say any dhulm that is done is in the hands of people between human beings. So they try to push Allah out of it by saying when human beings take each other's rights, going back to that definition of human justice, they say that's the one we can apply. If we're going to apply anything, we'll use that one. So it's just between human beings. So between now the quote-unquote oppressed, humanly oppressed, not divinely, humanly oppressed, and this Khalifa, which if they want to call an oppressor, fine, that's a matter between these individuals. That's why you'll also see in their theology, if ashab start fighting and arguing, they can't give preference to one or the other. They'll say, well, a difference in ijtihad. But if they're Ash'ari, then what does difference in ijtihad mean? It's going to go back to Allah. Like, is Allah's different ijtihad? Like it. I know it's tough for us to comprehend, and this is one of the blessings, but at the same time, I don't want to call it a curse. We are so lucky that we have a cohesive, coherent theology that everybody else's just seems laughable to us. But remember, if they're raised that way, it's going to make sense to them. They try to talk about free will. They do talk about it. But and again, we don't have time to go through it. Shaykh Mutahari doesn't really care about their in-depth discussion about it. It's not a major part of the conversation. But the issue, of course, is they try to talk about how maybe there's this feeling, or people feel like they have this sense of justice, or free will, but they don't really have it. It's a problem, right? Because they're trying to protect Allah, they take away the agency of people. But then they can't explain how people think that they have free will. It becomes a problem for them to try to explain these ideas. Even when we, like in our comparative fiqh classes and theology classes, when our teachers, now again, maybe our teachers couldn't explain it very well because we have a bias with our own theology, but even trying to look at the words of the Ash'ari theologians to see how they explain free will, it's very tough for us to comprehend. Like, it just seemed, the same way, maybe this is a good analogy. When a Christian tries to explain the Trinity to us, it's just, we can't comprehend it, we can't understand it. Like, no, God is not 3 in 1, not 1 in 3. It doesn't make sense. You can't say He's distinct and the same. It won't work. Why? Because we have been so, alhamdulillah, forcibly given tawheed that everything else is a joke. It's impossible for our minds to comprehend it. It's just like this as well. Because the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam and the Quran, we have had a clear understanding of free will, of agency, of responsibility, of what it means to grow. Any other idea, just our soul can't comprehend it. But for them, in the beginning, if their scholars are coming and mentioning, no, you don't have free will, whatever you think, that's an illusion, that's not true. It's just Allah. You just don't know that it's Allah, right? Something like that. So I know it's tough for us to kind of understand. I can recommend you Ash'ari theological books if you want to read that to get a better understanding. But look at it in contemporary times. This is why this same group, and these groups that exist, and they're so-called ulama, what are they doing to people in Palestine? They don't tell them to rise up. They don't tell them to fight back. They say, no, have sabr. Or they'll somehow say that this is your own fault, that they try to blame them for their own problems as well too. In all these Arab countries, with all these dictators and authoritarian individuals, who have no consideration for Islam whatsoever, which of these scholars is coming out and saying, okay, rise up and do something about it? No, they don't do that. So they have a broken theology. And this is kind of the major point here. Because of that broken theology, because of their broken usul, what does it turn into? Broken furu. Their a'mal, their actions become laughable as well too. A lot of people, this conversation comes up, those of us who, all these abstract, theological, philosophical, metaphysical discussions, all this aqidah that seems like it's heavy, like, why? Just give me some advice so that I can grow, so that I can, help people out. I want to do better, right? Be practical. Like that sounds great, but the problem is the practical comes from the theoretical. And the reason why many of us, we don't have an idea of what practically to do, what is my application right now, what is the amal and a'ma that I need right now, it's because our theology is misunderstood. Given recent years, many individuals who maybe never even thought about this before, right? When it comes to, let's say, Palestine, when it comes to Lebanon right now, to those in Yemen, to the Shi'ahs in Hijaz, to those in Iran, everywhere, right? Pakistan, wherever Shi'ahs or Muslims or anybody's being oppressed, you see, I've had this conversation and these doubts have come up to me more so in the past few years than ever before, where people are asking, how can Allah allow this? How can He do this? Is it their fault? Did they do something wrong? Are they culpable? Are they responsible for this? Can we do anything? What is it besides dua or whatever it is? So this is obviously an important conversation. And when some had tried to give the framework philosophically, they said, no, we don't want that, we want the action items. The problem is if you get action items, it'll only take care of one specific situation. Because in every situation, every circumstance, the actions will change. What, for example, might be the best thing to do for the Palestinians might be different than what we would need to do for those in Lebanon, which would be different than those in Iran, which would be different than those who are in our own community. The actions are not going to be the same. And if there's some vague principle that's given that do ihsan and be good and be just to everybody, what does that mean? Like if I give $100 to this group, I have to give 100 to everybody, which we'll go through how that's clearly not a good definition of this. So when we lose out on the abstract, the philosophical, the metaphysical, we see how quickly our actions crumble. For these schools of thought, you see how their actions are now a joke in the Muslim world. Whereas now you see many of the Ahlul Sunnah, they realize that our scholars are jokes too. But what kind of broken theology that we have? Amongst the Sunnis right now, they're arguing about this. Is this the theology that we were a part of? Where somebody can come along, our speaker, our scholar, our imam will come along, their imam, not our imam obviously, right? That their speakers, their qurra, their reciters of the Quran, these famous individuals will say that the Shi'as are a greater enemy than Zionists. Right? This is what happens when they have these kind of broken ideology, broken philosophy, broken ideas in Usul al-Din, and how it's had that benefit throughout socio-political history. So I know it's maybe not the full answer, but for the full answer would require, I guess, deeper works into the Ash'ari theology. Right? Please recite a salawat. Okay, so this was the Ash'aris. At the end of the day, same conclusion, right? They're like, there's no point, no justice, injustice, everything is from Allah, we're done. Okay, now the other mutakallimin, the Mu'tazilis and the Shi'as, or the Shi'i. Now they said, of course, we can use the aql, we can think about good and evil, we can think about justice and injustice. Now, of course, there were differences on how both these groups approached it. That's the whole point of the conversation. And we already talked about how there were minor differences. But the basic points were what? Belief in justice, belief in some level of good and evil, that they are real things. They're not made up. That there's some real objective, concrete reality to justice, to injustice, to good and evil. And of course, there are differences between both groups, as we mentioned, right? We don't agree exactly with how the Mu'tazilis conceptualize these ideas. Now, this group, the Mu'tazilis, their issue was that we're taking a human definition, right? Whatever we understand, our aql understands, our common sense, we apply that to Allah. That's where we differed, obviously. We said, no, we don't have human justice, we have divine justice, which is a bit different. But again, to reiterate their point, since the Mu'tazilis, and some Shias probably said this as well too, I don't want to say it's only Mu'tazilis, some Shias probably said, since our aql understands justice, and it understands justice is good, and we know that good is a concrete thing, we also know that our aql understands that injustice is evil, we know that Allah is perfect, Allah is infinite. If we're talking about aql, then the infinite and most perfect aql is going to be with Allah, whatever that means. Allah is the one who gave it to us in the first place and gave us this understanding of good and evil and injustice and injustice. So why wouldn't Allah use that same framework that we would understand too? So they try to take the idea of human justice and apply it to divine justice, right? Basically saying that our justice is just an extension of divine justice. That's how they try to apply it. We understand good and evil, justice and injustice through our aql, our intellect. That intellect in its perfect form is with Allah. Allah is the one who gave it to us. So since He gave it to us and gifted it to us, there's no way that He could go against the framework that we are supposed to live by ourselves as well. That's, again, we talked about it in detail in the introduction, but this was in a nutshell. But we want to go on to are the other groups, the groups that we haven't talked about yet. The next group are the Hukamaa. So Hukamaa, singular is Hakim. So Hukamaa just means philosopher. I'm not sure, I'm running out of space over here, I'll write it over there. So Hukamaa comes from the same word as hikmah, right? What we call wisdom. Those engaged in the science or discipline of wisdom are called philosophers, right? I mean, there's a whole discussion on what philosophy actually means. It means lovers of wisdom. That's where the word actually comes from. So in Islam, we don't, I mean, you can, nowadays they use a word in Arabic for philosophy or even in Farsi or Urdu, fine. But in our texts, they're known as Hukamaa, those who are lovers of wisdom, right? So that's how it's being mentioned, how it's discussed. So this approach now is completely different. And as we mentioned, as Shaykh Mutahari was outlining in the introduction, this is the whole crux of the conversation, is that these previous methodologies were insufficient. They were unsatisfactory because they still left too many open-ended questions. We need to go a bit deeper here. So, of course, to start off, they're saying the same thing. They're like, okay, we obviously know that there's no partners with Allah, so no shirk. Right? Obviously, they don't want any shirk. So, we can't have concepts and ideas alongside Allah. So, in a sense, okay, you Ash'aris, you were right. We can't have partners with Allah. We can't hold Allah accountable to anything else. We can't say Allah's accountable to justice, accountable to goodness, or anything like that. So, they said, fine, we agree. We don't want shirk. We also agree that, right, obviously Allah can't do dhulm. He can't be a zalim. Right? So we agree there too. We're starting off on the same page. Where now the difference happens is that, of course, they are accepting of free will, just like this group. Yes, humans have free will. Mu'tazilis, if you remember, they said no, absolute free will, tafweed. And the Shi'as, or at least the philosophers and many of the Shi'a theologians said no, it's not absolute, right? It's between both, amr bayn al-amrayn. But yes, there's agency. Allah is not the only actor in the world. Whereas the Ash'ari said no, He's the only one. Say no, we have agency too. It's not complete, but we do have agency. Now what about good and evil? Another difference between the philosophers and the other groups. It said good and evil, the other groups, like the Mu'tazilis and certain Shias, were saying good comes before or alongside Allah. Right? Let me write it out. So the claim was Allah, right, in terms of His act or His actions. In order for Him to, like before He acts, He quote unquote has to think about the idea of good and evil or justice and injustice, whichever way you want to frame it. And if His act complies with this, then fine, He can do A. If it complies with this, then okay, He can do B. So in other words, the way that they were explaining it, which the Ash'ari said this is a problem, and we said it's a problem too, is no, we can't hold Allah accountable. You can't say that goodness and evil and justice and injustice comes before Allah's actions, because that's what's technically happening. Allah can't contemplate something or think about it before doing something. Right? He just has to act. So for them, good and evil is not a prior action. For them, they say this, good and evil, justice and injustice, or let's say good and evil specifically for now, let's take this out. This is coming afterwards. It's not a prior idea. Don't use it as a standard. And very specifically, they said it doesn't even come at this level either. It has to come down at this level, where we call it a human convention. Good and evil, we're not even applying it to the divine realm in the first place. It's only meant for us humans. It's for us and that's it. So there's two different concepts that we have. So I'll give you the Arabic. One is i'tibari. And one is Haqeeqi. This is a term that they use in philosophy and other sciences, but usually philosophy. I'tibari means something is conventional, superficial, made up. And then Haqeeqi means no, something's actually real. So as an example, which we'll mention in a minute or two, the idea of ownership. Ownership is not some real idea that exists. It's a convention that you and I and humans made up so that we can observe each other's rights, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, inshallah. That's it. There's no real idea of ownership that exists out there. Or, I'm trying to think of another example, like tallness. There's no real idea of tallness. It's when we compare two different things, you see this one is taller than this one. But there's no concrete idea of tallness out there in the world. It's just a comparative thing, that's it. So it's something that we've kind of made up just to compare and contrast and deal with our lives. That's what conventional things happen to mean, right? Another simple one is any law that you and I come up with or any society comes up with, those are conventional laws. If somebody stops at a red light or stops at a stop sign, that's conventional. We made that up, or a human made that up. But on the other side, if I place my hand on fire and I get burnt, we didn't make that up, that's real. That's a real system of cause and effect, that's Haqeeqi. So hopefully the difference is understood. Right? So out of all of this, now they come with their conclusion. After all these ideas, they say, fine, we agree or we believe Allah is just. But it's not because of the reasons that anybody else has said so. It's not because of what the Mu'tazilis were trying to do of talking about good and evil. It's not because justice is good and injustice is evil, right? That's what the rest, Mu'tazilis and others said. That's not the reason they believe in it. The reason that inshallah we'll come to is a bit different than theirs, right? So it's not because Allah is applicable to something, that He's accountable to something, or that there's some standard that Allah has to act by. Their reason for good and evil, which we'll mention in the next section, has to do with the idea of everything, every existent, having a capacity to exist and receive existence and perfection and kamal. This has to do with Allah being just. But that's one of the definitions that we, either today or next week, we'll go through and we'll mention what that means specifically, inshallah. And then there's one more group that we have to mention, unless there's any questions about this. So again, it was their duty to address, so I'm going to just put this arrow up here. So the final group is, now the way that it's translated in the English text is that those who are adept at, I think, natural sciences or something like that. I'm going to use a different word, empiricists. Right. You can say scientists if you want, but empiricists I think is a bit more correct. So, up until now, what it seems like for other groups is that this question of divine justice, Quran and Hadith haven't really answered it. We know that there's something there, but the details we can't figure it out through the Quran and Hadith yet. So in other words, all of you simple theologians, you didn't answer the question enough. You might say that fine, God is just and it's good and okay, fine, but when we look out in the world, we're still seeing issues. So you haven't answered it fully yet. Okay? So the question becomes, can the problem, for them at least, can the problem of divine justice, can it be solved through a purely empirical or scientific methodology? Can the physical sciences answer this question? Because their whole idea, which we'll mention in a second as well too, is, again, they said that these traditionalists, it didn't solve it, right? They just didn't even discuss it. This first group, they lost the conversation as well too. Those who believed and tried to use the aql, they still missed out on a lot of points. The philosophers, they said, we don't even agree with that methodology. We don't agree with using the aql in the first place as a methodology, and I'll mention why in a few minutes. But for them, they said, no, we need to use science. So what do you think? Do you think that it's possible to solve this issue through just a simple empirical methodology? Why or why not? Sorry? No, how are you going to measure it? Okay, well, can somebody using science or the physical world, let's put it that way, can they get to God's existence, that God exists or Creator exists? Not fully? What does that mean? Because God is not physical. But at least is there an ishara and an indication through scientific method? Yeah, right? So, and that specific argument that's used is what? The argument by design, or teleological argument. That it is based on science. It's looking out at the world, seeing, right, Allah says, Siru fil ard, look out at the world, think about it, reflect it, and you'll come to the idea that there's a creator, that there's order and everything is beautiful. You know, that's we're commanded to do as well too. So because of that, that's the methodology that they utilize as well too. Now the second sort of question as well too is, when we're talking about empiricists, who exactly are we talking about over here? Which groups? Non-Shi'ah? Atheists? Exclusively? Or anybody else? So non-Shi'ah, yes. Atheists, yes. Agnostics, yes. Muslims, not just non-Shias, but Shias as well, yes. Basically, anybody can fall into this category, because this is about a methodology that's being used. It's not bound by a specific religion or belief system necessarily, right? So anybody, and we'll mention why now. So first thing we talk about is, okay, let's talk about their method first, right? So, yes, as you were saying, the empirical method is that everything needs to be observable. That's what the empirical methodology means. Everything needs to be, based on senses, based on experimentation, observation. That's how we figure out what is true and false. That's what we're doing. We look at reality, and then we can make conclusions, right? That's what it works. That's how it has. So because of that, they say all this rational, logical stuff, we toss that away. These proofs that you mutakallimin and you philosophers offer, what's the point? Going back to the previous point, it's all this abstract, metaphysical, stuff in some reality that's not ours. Who cares? We live in this physical world. We need proofs from the physical world. Don't bother with all this, let's say, highfalutin stuff. Right? That's not applicable to us. And they said, look, since we can get to Allah through this method, the scientific, observable method, we should do that for everything. That's the way that they approached everything, right? So let me break down a bit more what this means. So in epistemology or in logic or whatever science you want to talk about, there's two different ways that you can try to establish something being true. One of them is called a priori argument, and one of them is called an a posteriori argument. Anybody heard these terms before? A priori, they're both Latin. From, this is like from the prior or from the early, and this is from the later. And what does that mean? We talked about this a little bit in one of the sessions. We have all these, let's say, kind of general principles, and these exist in, call it some higher realm, up there in the sky, whatever you want to say. And then we have these, the observable world. So now, the observable world. So there's two different ways of, two different methods of trying to get to a truth of an item. If I go from a general principle, my starting point is here, and then I go and I apply it to the observable world, that's called a priori. Meaning it's from the early. I'm going to a higher principle, and then I'm applying it to something in the physical world. So there are generally maybe only three disciplines that engage in this. So metaphysics. Anybody want to guess the other two? Logic, mantiq, ahsant. And one more. One that is, it's more abstract, but we still apply it in our day-to-day life. Math, ahsant. right? So if I come up with something called the transitive property, I can now apply that to any instance I want in the observable world. The principle, the idea of the transitive property, whatever, comes from here, but I'm applying it over here. In logic, you come up with these ideas of premise A, premise B. If they're both true, then you'll get a conclusion. Okay, so that's coming with general principles and then applying it to the observable world. In metaphysics, you have every effect requires a cause. It's a general principle that we apply to the observable world. You go from higher and you apply it to the lower. And then of course, then the exact opposite, or the other way around, that's what is in a posteriori. You start here from the observable world, and then you try to form some sort of general principle from that. That's where the empirical sciences come in, right? Physical sciences. Why, what are they doing? Let's look at the world, let's experiment, and when we experiment over and over again, we can come up with this idea of gravity. We can come up with the boiling point of water, whatever it is. So they take what they think are facts or observations. There's no such thing as a scientific fact, it's just an observation. And then they say we've observed and experimented enough times that we're going to give some theory. They call it a law, but it can never really be an actual law. It's going to be some theory. So this method is what these individuals want to utilize. They say, why? Because we live in this world. We need to use the methodology that's appropriate and makes sense to us. That's how it has to function. And as they've already proven God, they said we have a teleological argument, and there's many different types. The famous one being argument from design, as I'm sure we're all familiar with, that this universe has order and design. Anything that has order and design requires a creator. Therefore, this universe requires a creator. Like, it's simple. It involves logic, sure, but the ideas in each premise are coming from the natural world. And you see a lot of people, when we try to prove God, we use the same idea, that look at the orbits, that nothing is going into chaos in the world. We're looking at what's going on in the world right now. We see how everything subsists, how it functions perfectly. It's like this perfect functioning is showing a perfect creator. That's the idea. So that's what's known as an a posteriori argument. And that's what this group wants to use. They said for justice, we have to do the same exact thing then. Because all this going from here to there, that's not going to work for us, and they don't want to apply that. Now, of course, there's a problem. So one problem that's laid out is, now this is an issue for everybody. For every single one of these groups, all Muslims, non-Muslims too, are dealing with the problem of divine justice. But this group, it's, according to Shaykh Mutahari, it's more important and more difficult for them. Any idea why? Why would this be more important for them and then more difficult at the same time? Yes. No.
Burden of proof.
So burden of proof, meaning what?
Everything that they claim has to have a full set of proofs.
Has to have what, sorry?
A full set of proofs.
A full set of proofs. Empirical proofs, yeah. So that, they've restricted their methodology. So that's already one problem. You're right. Because they have now boxed themselves in and said, all we have is this methodology, they can't go outside of it now. And they put themselves in that box. That's the one problem, yeah. The other is, for other groups, any of these other groups, if they're unable to solve the problem of divine justice or any other issue that exists in Islam or their theology, they can use other methodologies and approaches. They're not restricted. And if they even can't answer the question, they said, look, we still have an iman that we can rely on as well too. So yeah, maybe I can't answer the question of why Allah does this or why He doesn't do this, fine, but I still have iman in Allah. The problem with this group is, or again, sorry, give an example. The average mu'min, average believer in any faith, most of these, they probably have some very vague idea of what justice and wisdom and all these things mean. Nobody sits there and reads books like this and goes through these conversations. But at the end of the day, almost all of us will say, well, even if I can't answer it, I know that God is just. I know it. I'm not just going to toss that idea away. And that's one of the reasons why that the qalb or iman that sits in the qalb, sits in the metaphysical heart, the immaterial heart, has a superiority over what we call logic and reason. Logic and reason has its like an endpoint. It can't reach everything necessarily. But iman, the qalb, can reach higher levels. And technically, it's the aql has to sometimes convince there's a whole complicated way that it works, but Allah can put something directly in our heart without us ever needing a proof in the first place. That's one of the gifts and blessings that we have as well too. Many people just say, look, this is one of God's mysteries. I don't need to understand. I don't care if I understand or not. That's the way Allah wants to do it. Let it happen. You see Christians, Jews, Muslims, people say that all the time. It's a mystery. It's okay. I'm fine with that. This group, they can't say that. Why? Because they have a problem. Let's write out what's the issue is for them. So, now going to the problem. Okay, so if the universe or creation, if it's good, or if it's just, then they can make the conclusion that, okay, fine, God is just. Because everything for them is based on what they're observing, right? But the problem is now, what if instead, in the universe, they're seeing evil and injustice? If that's what they see in the observable universe, then the unfortunate conclusion that they're going to end up reaching is that God is now unjust. They have no other conclusion that they can draw. Because what they say is that this creation, this world, the cosmos, the universe, whatever Allah creates, is a reflection of Him. If we see goodness, then okay, that's what Allah is. But if we see evil and injustice and discrimination and pain and suffering, sorry, then Allah that's a reflection of Allah then. So what ends up happening is, since some of them can't and could not resolve this problem, what did that do? Is they just went all the way back, and you know what? Sorry, we have to cut out the whole concept of God in the first place. Now, many people, they think that atheists, their problem is proving or not proving, or the lack of proof of God's existence. That's actually not the case for most atheists. This is where they actually end up failing. They have some level where they thought they was some belief in God and Allah. They get to the question of good and evil, of justice and injustice. It could not be answered, and because they were strict in their empirical method, they said, well, we can't answer this. So then they only have a few possible conclusions. Either God doesn't exist, that's one option. They say because the only way some of them think God can exist is if He's good. Well, we already proven that He's not good because of the world, so therefore there's no God. That's one conclusion. Another is that, okay, fine, maybe He does exist, but then He's not good. Maybe He does exist, but He's not all-powerful. Otherwise He would have stopped these things. He would have stopped injustice. Maybe He is good, and maybe He's powerful, but He's not knowledgeable. Maybe He doesn't know what's going on. Na'udhu billah. So they had to, as the question happened with, and the issue happened with all these other scholars, they had to get rid of some aspect of Allah to make it make sense. There's no coherency left for them, and that's what happened with them as well too, because of that very limited methodology. And then they said, look, if God is good, but He's not powerful, or He's not knowledgeable, or if He's powerful and knowledgeable, but He's not good, or any of these weird mix of ideas, then at the end of the day, who cares about, na'udhu billah, who cares about Allah? What's the point? As many of these empiricists and naturalists and self-proclaimed atheists say, why would they worship a God who cannot do any goodness and create a good, perfect world? That's what they keep claiming. Like, He's not worthy of my worship. That's how they say it. People like Neil deGrasse Tyson and all these others. Like, why would I bother with this? And there was a minority, for example, of rabbinical scholars, of rabbis, after the Holocaust who said the same thing. They said, look, if this is the case, that God can allow something like this to happen to us, the chosen people, then forget it, there is no God. Or they came up with another conclusion. Again, this is a minority of them. They said, if God is there, then He's not powerful then, because He should have stopped that. So they had to delete, some aspect of Allah. That's how they tried to reconcile it. Right? Again, this is where, if our theology is not sound, these are the kind of conclusions that we can end up reaching. And you see that how it affects children, it affects adults, all different people alike. If they cannot see this world in its perfection through the eyes of Allah, then all they're going to see is the imperfection. And this is what the media capitalizes on. This is what social media capitalizes on. This is what false demagogues and ideologues, this is what they capitalize on. People who don't have a strong, thabit, stable understanding of religion and God and theology. So now a few doubts can creep in and destroy everything that they've built up. And this is one of the reasons why it's good. We have to be careful of relying too much on the empirical method. I know many of us, maybe that's how we learned a lot of these ideas that, oh, look at the Quran, it talks about this idea. it talks about the Big Bang, or it talks about the fetus, and all these ideas. Maybe, maybe not. If we rely too much on force-feeding empirical sciences in the Quran, it might come back and bite us. We have to be very, very careful with that. I'm sure many of you remember, at least when I was growing up, people said that this ayah over here is talking about the Big Bang. You see how Allah, it was predicted. Now what's going to happen, because the Big Bang is just a theory, it's not a fact. There are multiple other theories in cosmology, in astronomy. They said that's not the only theory, there's other theories as well about the nature of, quote unquote, the beginning of the universe. It's not just the Big Bang, there's other things too. It could be something else. It could be that there are infinite universes oscillating back and forth, coming in and out of existence. Right? Not just one, quote unquote, Big Bang or whatever. Or maybe it's all an illusion, right? They have various theories. So if now the next prevailing theory comes along and says, no, actually we've disproven the Big Bang, then what we have to do, we have to backtrack and say, oh, that ayah didn't talk about the Big Bang. And now nowadays what people are doing is, well, quantum mechanics, quantum physics, that's the cool new trend. So now what are people doing? Oh look, Allah's talking about quantum mechanics and string theory in the Quran. Like, why are you doing it again? You're repeating yourself. Once this changes or becomes disproven, or they change their idea, you're going to have to go and backtrack again. We don't need to force feed outside ideologies into the Quran, right? You have to be careful of that. This is something for those who have seen. I know most of us, when we try to read a tafsir, we jump right into the actual ayat or the surah. It's important that we read the introduction to Tafsir al-Mizan as well, especially Tafsir al-Mizan. Allāmah Tabatabai, radhiyallahu alayhi, in the beginning outlines all these different ideas about how you approach the Quran, and this is one of the main ideas. He said all these different groups that exist, especially this group, they're just force-feeding their own presumptions and assumptions into the Quran, and they take whatever they want from it. Rather than saying, I am an open book, or I am nothing, Allah, in the Quran, you tell me how to think and how to observe reality and the world. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So, this is this subsection. Now he says, okay, with all these preliminaries, now we can go into the first set of questions, which is what is justice? How do we actually define this? There are multiple different definitions of this as well too. He's going to go through 4. So either there are 4 meanings, or in 4 situations they're used. And he's going to show the value or the lack of value in each one of those. I can probably wait till next week, inshallah. So he'll go through, I guess I'll just outline them now. So the first one he'll go through is the idea of justice, meaning balance, meaning mizan, that everything has to be in a state of equilibrium. Then he talks about the next one, which people mention, is they talk about the idea of equality. That everything has to be tasawi, has to be equivalent and equal. That's justice, meaning no discrimination at all. Third one is that everything has to be given its due. Everything has to be put in its proper place. And then the final one, which is the one that we have to spend the most time on, which is the one that's used in this book, which is called ontological justice, or the only one that can be applied to Allah, which is that Allah does ifada. He emanates and gives wujud and kamal to anything that can handle it. I know that might not sound like much right now, but we'll explain what that means, inshallah. That's the main one that we begin to start opening up in the future chapters, inshallah. Any questions or comments? Whatever Allah forces me to do, then that's what we talk about. Inshallah, we'll see what happens. Anything else? Sorry? Empirical proof? No empirical proof. No empirical proof. There's no theological proof. There's no philosophical proof. No metaphysical proof. No mathematical proof. There's nothing except for, actually no, the scientific proof, empirical proof would be because the behavior has been repeated and because we've continued every week, our assumption is that the same thing will happen next Friday, is that we continue on in the book. So that would be the empirical one. The heart? In this case, you follow your heart, right? I don't know what I'm going to follow, but you follow your heart. Okay, well, we'll continue inshallah next week. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ahli baytihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.